Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and never miss an episode, I invite you to join the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Please visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. When you join the Patreon family, you'll instantly unlock access to exclusive posts, including audio releases and videos. Patrons are also eligible to attend additional monthly live talks and take part in a member-only book club. They can also enter patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the podcast to talk about his latest book, A Gentleman from Japan, is Thomas Lockley. Thomas Lockley is Associate Professor at Nihon University College of Law, where he researches and teaches themes related to the international history of Japan. He has published numerous papers and several books, the best known of which is African Samurai, concerning the life of Yasuki, the African man who served and fought beside Oda Nobunaga. His latest book is A Gentleman from Japan, the untold story of an incredible journey from Asia to Queen Elizabeth's court. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Thomas. How are you?
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's nice to be in the same time zone for once. And thank you so much for having me on. It's a lovely honor to be here with you today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for making the time. Yes, Thomas is actually in Japan, everyone. So this is my first guest that I'm recording with that is actually residing in Japan. So that's exciting. So Thomas, maybe just tell us a little bit about you and your background.
We started with Japan, so I'll go from there. I'm born in the UK, but I came to Japan originally 24 years ago and have been here most of at least 3/4 of the time since. Japan is very much my home, which is why a Tudor Japan story, when it came up, just had to be written. There aren't any other Tudor Japan stories that just don't exist, but they do. And when I found one and I was looking for a new book project to follow on from the last book I did on African samurai, on the African who became a samurai here, I thought, why don't you find a Japanese person who did something similar overseas at the similar time in history? And hence I'm here talking to you today.
Yeah, wonderful. So you are referring there to your latest book, which is called A Gentleman from Japan. Such an interesting story. So maybe could you just tell us a little bit about your book and also perhaps the inspiration and maybe what readers can expect to find in this book?
Yes, this book, as far as I know, is the only book on the Tudors which focuses on the Japan connection. There are others which focus from James I time, but I've never read one that just focuses on the Tudors. And essentially what happened is 2 Japanese boys and 3 boys from Manila were taken by Thomas Cavendish on his circumnavigation and taken to London. What they did there has been virtually forgotten, but at the time it was a rather big deal. And there were lots and lots of documents sprinkled around, letters, pamphlets, word of mouth, recorded in ditties in the stationer's office, and all sorts of other things. What I did was to put those together to form a coherent pattern, a coherent story about what these boys did. Actually, not boys. Christopher, the protagonist, who is the one who had most written about him, was around about 21 when he actually got to England. So he's not a boy, he's a man. The youngest was 9 years old, and he's obviously definitely still a boy. Anyhow, what happened to them in England was nothing short of astonishing. They were basically taken to meet the Queen. But the book itself builds up the world around them. So the world of Japan, of California, where they met Cavendish after he took the Santa Ana, the Spanish galleon, and what comes in between, that whole year's voyage from Southern California to London, Plymouth first, then to Greenwich, then to London. And it also builds up the story afterwards, when they don't make it back to Japan, why they don't make it back to Japan, what was going on around the world at the time. And that was the fun bit for me to write, because it really was a different world from what we know today. Like, in no uncertain terms, we can't even begin to understand how those people lived and died.
Yeah, it sounds so fascinating. And so maybe actually that's probably a good segue into the next question I had for you, which is about what is actually happening in the world, in England and around the world in around 1588. So could you maybe set that scene for us a little bit before we talk more about other aspects of your work?
Well, for English history, 1588 is one of the most significant years because the Spanish Armada was foiled. You can't really say the word defeated because the weather did the job, but the Spanish King Philip failed in his invasion attempts thanks to weather and thanks to bad planning on his officers' part. And therefore, England escaped an invasion which would inevitably have changed England's history, fundamentally from zero upwards. Around the world, obviously, starting from England outwards and going to Spain. Spain is at the height of its power because it's getting all of this gold, silver, and various other resources from its American colonies. It's basically using human trafficked people, slaves, enslaved people to get these resources and bringing them back to Europe. Well, the rest of the Europeans are kind of envious of this and want in on the act. And that's what's starting to build other Europeans trying to get to the Americas. In the Americas themselves, we don't really have a big European presence. It's still very much an indigenous place. The people that live there are mostly indigenous, although many of them have been wiped out by diseases at this point. The English don't manage to make any headway at this point. And that's where the book actually starts, because Thomas Cavendish started his sailing career by sailing to Roanoke, which is supposedly known as the first English colony. But it wasn't a colony, it was actually a pirate outpost. The idea was to be able to plunder Spanish ships. Over to Asia. We've gone through Europe, America, over to Asia. We've got 2 or 3 very powerful realms. We've got India, we've got China, and we've got Japan, which is in the middle of a civil war, but just starting to get out of the civil war and just starting to develop into a unified realm. It's not quite there. And essentially, England and other European nations are aware of this, and they're trying to get in on the act because the richest place in the world is China, and everybody wants their silk, their products, their knowledge, medicine especially. The English were wild for medical knowledge and herbology, we would call it today, but it was basically drugs, because these legends have been seeping back to Europe for centuries, even a millennium perhaps. That's it. We've got a world on the move. We've got a world where for the first time it's really possible to move, even very slowly, but the shipping technology, or on land, camels, horses, and the stability needed that people can move around is just about there.
And you mentioned earlier when you were chatting, you mentioned Christopher, the 20-year-old or so young man. He's pretty much the protagonist of your story. So what do we actually know about him and his life?
Well, we know that he first enters the historical record in California when he meets Cavendish. And at that point, that's recorded in Hakluyt, which is the Bible of the English voyagers and the English mariners of the time. So that's recorded in Hakluyt. When they get to England, Hakluyt is just about to release this book, but he changes his introduction to the book to say that these guys are here. And isn't it wonderful that they can speak English and they're dealing with the rain, and other lovely little ditties like that, which seem really consequential to him, I guess. And for us, they're just kind of cute. I mean, of course, they're dealing with the rain. They were taken there. They couldn't do anything else, but it's still nice, right? Christopher deals with rain. He's learned English by the time he got there. It's a year on a ship, right? We know that he was literate in Japanese. We know that he could write as well as read, which is very rare at the time. There's a court case in Manila which suggests that the other Japanese lad was an enslaved valet, if you like, to one of the Spanish priests on the ship, but we don't know about Christopher. Judging from his skills and what he does in London, which I'm going to not give away again, probably a mariner, a sailor. He certainly knew what he was talking about, and the English really used this knowledge to great effect. And some of what the English achieved in the coming decades was thanks to Christopher's knowledge transfer from Japan and from China, because the technologies were similar. What else do we know about Christopher comes later in journals and letters and a few entries in some books of the time. We know that he was a very, very good friend of a man called Anthony Knivet, who had all sorts of adventures in South America and then came home to be head of the Royal Mint after he'd escaped Portuguese captivity. Him and Christopher, it's recorded in there that they were the best friends ever. What that exactly means, not quite sure. I don't think it particularly means that they were lovers, but it does mean that they were certainly very, very good pals, and they did all sorts of things together, and then suddenly they have an argument. And that's recorded in the diary as well. And these tiny little details are what make human stories, right? And I think Christopher's story has those things just because the people weren't censoring themselves. They were just talking on a piece of paper. They were just writing what they thought. And therefore, we actually know far more than we normally know about people 400 years later.
Yeah, that's so wonderful to have those sources, because you're right. Of course, so we spend so much time looking for that kind of internal landscape of the people we're studying, and it's so difficult. I know, because I study a lot of women, almost non-existent until you get to the 17th century and you get some of those diaries, wonderful diaries. So that's amazing. So I want to just go back to Japan for a moment. What's their relation like at this point with all the other sort of major European powers?
Well, most of Europe hasn't gone anywhere near Japan yet. And most Japanese haven't gone anywhere near Europe yet. There's one mission from Japan which arrives in Europe in 1584. It's a Catholic mission, so it tours the Catholic countries, Spain and Portugal, Spain and the Italian peninsula, before going back to Japan via Portuguese or Spanish enclaves around the world. That was a very, very big thing in Europe, and there was hundreds of publications written about them. And I think that Christopher's story is in the shadow of that. Queen Elizabeth was so jealous that she didn't have her Japanese visitors. She really wanted one or two or three or whatever, any. And that's also recorded in the records connected to Christopher as well. Not in so many words, but it's very much suggested that. And I think Cavendish was trying to give her what she wanted there. In Japan, the Portuguese have had some presence since the 1540s. I mean, when we say presence, we simply mean there were a few merchants there and later on a few missionaries from the Jesuit order, who are mainly Portuguese, but there are some Spanish and Italians as well. We have lots of Africans who've gone with the Jesuits or with the Spanish, some as enslaved people, but others as bodyguards, warriors, even accountants. There were various different jobs. It was a very multicultural foreign community in those days. And just around the cusp of this time, we got the first Spanish arriving only because they're shipwrecked there. The Spanish and the Portuguese had an agreement, if you like, that they would not encroach upon each other's, what they thought were spheres of influence. I don't think the countries like China and Japan understood that they were somebody else's sphere of influence. And when they did, later on in further decades, they basically just got rid of the Portuguese and Spanish just like that. It was quick, brutal, and done by legal means.
When you were talking earlier, you also mentioned enslavement and the fact that one of Christopher's companions was an enslaved person. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about this time aboard the Santa Ana and enslavement and what was going on there?
I think Christopher was enslaved as well. He would have been enslaved in a different manner. The majority of Japanese people abroad at this time were either pirates or slaves. There wasn't many others. Japan was not unified and therefore didn't have a diplomatic service or a formal foreign policy, if you like. They were still too busy trying to get to grips with each other, the lords and others in Japan. So the slaves were either being exported by Japanese ships as well, of course, but also Portuguese ships and some Chinese ships as well. They formed, I would estimate, probably 90% of the Japanese people outside Japan at this time. Pirates, and again, some of these slaves were pirates as well. And it all gets a bit fuzzy around here. And I think Christopher is one of these semi-piratical mariners who had perhaps been enslaved, but was developing within the pirate body. You can read about it in the book. It was hypothesized. It's not true. We don't know that as fact, is the most likely story about his origins. So what we do know is that Christopher boarded the Santa Ana on the day it left Manila. So we know he was in Manila. Didn't stop anywhere on the way. And he's then taken the first stop in North America. So he had to be in Manila. The only Japanese people in Manila at this time were pirates and slaves. Therefore, he was one of those. But how he got there is unclear. There are some very, very clear pointers as to how that he got there, and I've basically written about that in the book and hypothesized those possibilities.
And so you've obviously alluded to the fact that he meets Thomas Cavendish and that a relationship forms between the men. So how much does Christopher's life change following this meeting?
Well, Cavendish had no right to do this, but somehow Christopher becomes known as a gentleman. That's not kind of guy that opens the door for a lady. That is an aristocratic rank. And by the time he gets to Plymouth, he's being referred to all over Europe as a gentleman of the Indies. This brings a lot of questions. How did this enslaved person suddenly become a noble? Read the book to find out, but you can probably guess very easily what Cavendish was trying to do, and he was trying to big himself up through bigging up Christopher. When they met the Queen, or when we don't have a record of them actually meeting the Queen, but they were outside Greenwich Palace. Queen dined on board the ship. We know that all of the people on that ship, sailors, were dressed in blue silk, most expensive silk at the time, which they plundered from Santa Ana, the Spanish galleon. So part of their payoff had been these wonderful silk clothes, and they have these big gold chains. That's basically where they get their money. I guess they go melt them down somewhere and use the cash for the rest of their lives. That's their pensions, essentially. And some of them would have been rich forever. Christopher, though, is now a gentleman. His life has changed. He's dressed in silk with gold, and that's what Cavendish is doing. I suspect that he was a very, very loyal follower of Cavendish following this. During the time in England, we have perhaps 5 sources as to what was doing, and there are more that pop up all the time. It's not something that's it. We can finish this research here. Though, of course, I had to write the book sometime, so I had put the line up in the sand there. There are likely to be other sources that pop up at certain points to say, oh, there's an observation of this guy here. And as his story becomes better known, there'll be people that had heard about something to do with this and might contact me. It's happened before. It happened with Yaske, the African I used to write about. People start, oh, I know this story. I know this story. And then more comes together. So I'm really looking forward to seeing whether that happens with Christopher as well.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. So yes, if anyone's listening and they've got some sources or some stories, feel free to contact myself or Thomas, and that would be wonderful. So Elizabeth I was not a fan of people deceiving her, as we all know. She did not like to be lied to. So talk to us a little bit about how these visitors were received, and does she discover what Cavendish has done?
Well, she has to discover, and therefore there's an absolute silence. For a short while there's a silence. We get nothing between gentlemen and very later in this day, they're called naturalists, which is the contemporary term for a scholar or a scientist or something in the middle, somebody with knowledge of something different, should we say. More scholarly knowledge, not knowledge of how to build a ship, for example. This is more of a scholar type thing. I think, basically, she was furious. All record of what happened there has been expunged, and people have often wondered why Cavendish didn't get a knighthood, why all his money disappeared very quickly, and why, for somebody that completed the first ever planned circumnavigation in world history, and of course an extremely good candidate for an English national hero, why didn't he get knighthood? Why did he lose all his money? And why did he wasn't disgraced, but you don't hear much more about him contemporarily or now. Why not? I suspect it's because he deceived the Queen, and as you just said, she did not like to be deceived.
Absolutely. No, that was, one of her pet peeves, I think, to put it mildly.
In this world of men that are trying to control her for their own needs and their own purposes and targets, and she's got to see through them, doing exactly that. He was using somebody else to get to the Queen and trying to deceive her. I don't think belittling is the right word. He wasn't trying to belittle her, but he thought he could pull the wool over her eyes, perhaps. And she needed to be strong to make sure that she could see through their BS, basically, and she was good at that.
She certainly was. Let's talk a little bit about the contributions, because you did mention he obviously makes some really important contributions to the sort of scientific and seafaring world at this point in England. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
The first one is the map of China. Somehow on the voyage, Cavendish picks up this Chinese map, which doesn't just show China, it shows the coast and the seas around China as well. I think this is normally considered to be from a Portuguese pilot, a navigator that he picked up as well, and it's almost definitely from him. It was in Chinese. Nobody on the ship could read any Chinese or even hope to read any Chinese except for one or two people, and those were Christopher and Cosmos, his younger colleague. Christopher, though, is specifically recorded, well, they both are, but Christopher particularly is recorded as being extremely intelligent and literate. Therefore, it's very likely that they translated that into English. The map itself was translated and was published in Hacklit, the same other series that Christopher features highly in. I mean, there is no proof that it was. It doesn't say by Christopher at the bottom, but who else could have done it? Sadly, the map has been lost. But I did find a very similar description in Chinese to the English description. I think I've identified which map, or which type of map at least, that it was. These were printed maps, so there's lots of different copies of the same maps, because otherwise we would have had a much more difficult search there. Compasses. The English did not really have an effective compass at this time. This was a very dangerous thing. They were dry compasses. The lodestones were too expensive and too rare to be able to take with them on ships. That's the things that magnetize. You rub the steel and it's magnetized through the lodestone. After a few weeks or a few months, depending on how magnetic it was, the magnetism disappears. But the ships couldn't afford to take lodestones with them. So essentially you're sailing blind after a very short time. And if you're trying to go around the world, you got some problems. The English knew this, but Christopher had the knowledge of the Chinese compass, which was a liquid compass, much, much more effective. And the magnetism was also dealt with in different ways. And he helped an English researcher called Barlow to try and develop a new compass. Now, the one problem comes up there is that the English were often sailing in frozen waters above North America. They were trying to get through the Northwest Passage, etc., or the Northeast Passage above Siberia, and water freezes. So they couldn't use that. And it took another two or three centuries before the English actually worked out if you put alcohol in it, it won't freeze. But even in the early 19th century, the English Navy was saying they wanted the Chinese compasses. Barlow's compass that he eventually developed was very much better than the other compasses, and Christopher had helped him in some way to make this compass. So I think that's quite a significant contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so wonderful that now we get to meet this person that obviously contributed to these incredible finds. Can you tell us a little bit about what role Christopher plays in Cavendish's next attempt to reach the Far East?
Well, the sources suggest that he was going to be set up as the interpreter, or perhaps a trade representative or a diplomatic representative of the English in the Far East. Cavendish sets out. He doesn't take the Filipino lads. He leaves all three of them behind, which suggests that he wasn't heading for Manila, which was under Spanish control at this time anyway. It suggests very much, because he took two Japanese lads with him, that he was going for Japan, or possibly for China, or both. They still weren't quite sure where they were, remember? So it's kind of feeling out into the middle of the ocean. It must have been a nightmare. I can't even believe to think how brave these people were, or stupid these people were, to do this kind of thing. The details of the voyage, the orders from Elizabeth, etc., are very vague. It's just do what you can for the national good, basically. Paraphrasing it, that's what they're saying. Essentially, this was probably England's first voyage to Japan, but they didn't make it. It was an absolute disaster. Almost everybody dies at some point, including Christopher. I'll leave it there. The details are heart-rending, but it's one of those romantic tales with a very sad and poignant ending.
Goodness, what a tragedy. Yes, and I'm sure we all want to see all those details. So definitely, I recommend everyone buy your book and read your book. But before we sort of come to the end of our episode, you've obviously spent a lot of time immersed in Christopher's life in this period of history while you've been writing and researching. What do you think then is the enduring impact of Christopher's visit to England?
For a long time, the visit was absolutely forgotten. So the impact that he had was clouded over. But I think if you look at the navigational things, and we haven't talked about some of the other things he did as well, but particularly those navigational things, the English over the next century up until about the end of the 17th century are very much improving their equipment. From this point onwards, for a whole century, really putting a lot of effort into improving their equipment, their shipping, their knowledge of the world. Maps that Cavendish brought back of other places that he had made himself, incorporated into new maps and new maps and new maps, until the English have a much better idea of the world around them and the world on the other side of the world as well. Christopher was at the beginning of this. Christopher was right there. He also would have acted as a kind of inspiration. So as the first Asian person in England, the fact of him being there at all was astonishing. And we have records that say that. Of course, Hakluyt wrote that, et cetera, meaning that would have given an impetus. Oh, we've been looking for Asia for 100 years. Oh, and here's Asia. It's come to us right now. That kind of thing is where the real impact would have been felt over the centuries. If we look back at his story now, I think we can also see something that is more useful for us today in this new world that we are living in, this very different world. We can see that actually the propaganda which we were fed in the 19th century onwards about how wonderful and developed Queen Elizabeth's country was, and et cetera, which is basically to boost Queen Victoria, because there was a great queen before Queen Victoria, and therefore we have precedent for having a great queen. If we look back at it now and look at that propaganda and how that propaganda has affected our psyches and our thinking of the world, I think we can start to reassess that and make a more balanced view of both Elizabethan England and what came afterwards. So in the longer term, Christopher himself is not, you can't give him everything for that, but his story, his looking at his world is something we can reflect on and perhaps make a more balanced conclusions about the history of the last 400 years.
And just out of curiosity, you did mention that the other companions, the boys from Manila, actually stayed back in England. Did you uncover anything about their lives there, or are they sort of lost from that point?
That was one of those wonderful things that somebody who I'd been in contact with research found a little paragraph or two about them and sent it to me. They were on a mission, I think, over in the West Indies. I would need to go back to the source to check exactly. I think it was Dudley's stepson. I can't remember the exact details. Anyway, they were there. If I recall, they tried to jump ship and there was some mess there. Anyway, they probably died there, I think. The final lad, who was only 9 years old when he arrived, he's the only one that didn't even have a name. He was just called the final boy at 9 years old. He is recorded as being in Lettice Dudley's entourage 10 years later. So I suspect that he lived out his life in one of those stately homes, probably with Lettice, or perhaps afterwards with her own children, her daughters or sons.
Yeah, wouldn't it be fascinating to know more about that connection? That's so interesting. Thomas, thank you so much. This has been really insightful and so interesting, and a sort of fresh perspective to discuss about this amazing period of history. But I have one more question for you, and that is the Tudor takeaway. So I do ask all my guests for a takeaway, so something for our listeners to explore after the episode. So do you have a takeaway for us?
I think Tudors are often thought of being very inward looking, fighting together or fighting for the Queen's attention, as we were talking about earlier, or trying to maneuver around. A lot of what they were thinking about was light years away. They were thinking about China. They were definitely thinking about the Americas, as we know, but the Americas were only as a way to get to China. And Japan was even only a way to stop off on the way to China. Their thinking and what they were thinking about was so much bigger and on such a global scale. I mean, they had no chance of imposing any power or will on anywhere else at all, not even the Netherlands. They couldn't even manage the Netherlands, and they're having a hard time in Ireland. But the Tudors were very outward looking. They just didn't know how to get there. And that's what I think I'd like people to take away. And there's several chapters in the book about this conception of England in a world, as opposed to just England in the British Isles or England in Europe or England in Christendom. There's actually a far, far bigger thing there. That's what I'd like people to take away. And that's a good question. I didn't expect it, but thank you very much for asking.
No, that was an excellent answer, considering you hadn't had time to even think about it. So if people want to connect with you, if they want to follow your work, where can they go?
You can go on to Instagram or on Facebook. You can find my email fairly, very easily because people email me all the time. And I've got talks and things on YouTube and things, so please feel free to contact me anywhere.
And I'll add some links to our show notes, so that will make it easy for everyone to find you. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk Tudors with us. It's been really a fascinating conversation.
Thank you for having me. It has, and you've done a great job of asking these questions. Really stimulating. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful day.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as TheMostHappy78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.